everyone today for our conversation on solitary. Hopefully this is working now. And thanks to Alice and Beatrix for helping us sort through these technical issues. My name is Bobbin Singh. I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. And this week we're celebrating the end of the year with our annual event called Bending the Arc, where we'll be hosting a series of panel discussions on issues that we're working on or work that we're doing at the Oregon Justice Resource Center. This is also our 10-year anniversary, so we get to celebrate the end of the year in multiple ways. But I'm looking forward to this week. We have a lot of great conversations. Today we'll be talking about solitary confinement. Later this week, we'll be having a conversation about our policy work that we'll be doing in the upcoming legislative session, a conversation about our youth justice project and its work it's been doing this past year, and explaining the recent executive action by the governor here in Oregon. And finally, we'll be concluding the week with a panel on policing and what's been occurring nationally and locally with some really great panelists. So pay attention to our social media sites, and you'll be updated sort of daily on what where the conversations will be and who the panelists will be, but we're really excited again to have this conversation. Today, we get the distinct privilege of having, I think, one of the more important conversations on the criminal justice system, and that is the use of solitary confinement. Solitary has a lot of names, but that we'll discuss. But the basic premise behind solitary is isolating individuals for basically punishment. And as our speakers will note today, there are different ways we can think about solitaries, different ways solitaries present itself, and the impacts of solitary, and also how we are as a state and a country as it relates to solitary in its use compared to the rest of the world. There's a lot to get to, so what I want to first do is introduce our speakers. Today joining us will be Ben Haile, who's Senior Counsel for our Civil Rights Project, Anthony Pickens, who is a paralegal legal assistant for the Oregon Justice Resource Center and is formerly incarcerated and recently released, and he'll be talking about his personal experiences, and Dr. Kupers, who is, let's see, I have his bio right here. Well, actually, can't pull it up, I'm sorry, but he's a well-known psychiatrist that studied a lot about solitary, and I'll let him introduce himself. Sorry about that. So if we could just do quick introductions, I'll start with Dr. Cooper since I messed that one up. If you could just quickly introduce yourself, that would be great.
I am Terry Kupers. I'm a psychiatrist. I practice community psychiatry and also general practice, but I also have the privilege of serving as an expert witness in class action lawsuits, mainly about conditions in prison, jail, the mental health care, the effects of sexual abuse. I'm a professor at the Wright Institute, and I've written several books, two of which about prison. One is Prison Madness, about the mental health crisis behind bars. The other is Solitary, the inside story of supermax isolation and how we can abolish it. And that was published by University of California in 2017.
Great, thank you, Dr. Kupers. Anthony?
My name is Anthony Pickens. I'm formerly incarcerated as of about a month and a half ago, served 24 years. I'm a juvenile offender, went to jail when I was 15, did 24 years and was commuted by Governor Kate Brown, and appreciate that. And now I'm enjoying life in the free world.
Great, and Ben?
I'm an attorney with the Civil Rights Project at the Oregon Justice Resource Center. I've been focused on civil rights law on behalf of people in prison for about the last 15 years. My early focus was more on access to healthcare in prison, including mental health care as well as healthcare for urgent physical needs. I mainly represented the families of people who died in prison, and we were in solidarity with those family members in trying to use lawsuits as a way to reform the prison medical care system, or at least help slow the downward slide into worse and worse healthcare and try to make something meaningful come out of the deaths of people in prison. Lately, I've been focused more on trying to look at broader challenges to abolishing some of the horrible practices in prison, like solitary confinement and just the whole tragedy of mass incarceration and the damage that it does to our society. I'm
Thank you, Ben.
thrilled to be working with a great team at the Oregon Justice Research Center.
Thank you, Ben, Anthony, and Dr. Kupers. For today's conversation, what we're really hoping is to introduce solitary confinement to our supporters and to the public and to those who may be unfamiliar with this issue, and also to help sort of bolster the knowledge of those who may be familiar with solitary confinement. And the different perspectives we have, I hope, will provide a more rounded conversation. But we'll start with the basics and trying to understand what is solitary, defining terms, how it actually looks in Oregon, what are the policies and practices, and again, understanding the science behind it. What are the harms and how do they manifest? So to start the conversation, I think, really trying to understand like how this actually looks in Oregon and what it feels like. We'll have Anthony start off just by sharing his own personal experiences of being in custody and experiencing solitary, and then also perhaps sharing some anecdotes of individuals that he was with in his community and how they were impacted by solitary. So Anthony.
Hello, Anthony Pickens. Thank everybody for joining us in this conversation. As I mentioned earlier, I did 24 years of incarceration, went in at 15. My earliest experience with solitary confinement was actually when I was 16 years old, when I was still in the process of going to trial with my case. I was transferred to the Multnomah County Jail as a juvenile. At the time, this was 1998, and I was one of the first juveniles to be housed at the Adult County Jail. So when I arrived there, there was a long conversation about where to house me. They had no clue what to do with a juvenile in their facility. And so the best thing they can come up with for their own liabilities and what they said was my own safety was to put me in solitary confinement. Walking into solitary confinement, which is also known as the hole, there was a bunk on the floor on a slab of concrete, a sink, toilet together. And actually at this time where I was housed, the window, which would have been able to look outside to see the free world, was painted shut. So I had no access to seeing anything on the outside. My only visuals was able to look out of my door into the unit, which was concrete upon concrete. And at 16 years old, it was very difficult to deal with this. And basically all I did throughout the day was pace back and forth. I didn't even really have any books that was brought to me because they kept getting confused about where I was in the jail, which I don't know how they could get confused about where I was at. And so it started taking a big mental toll on me. And I was actually in solitary confinement from 16 to 18 in the county jail. Eventually, they moved me to a different cell, which gave me access to visual out into the community. And it was a little better being able to see some things that are normal, but it still was very taxing on my mind. And so I'm going through my case where I'm looking at potentially facing the rest of my life in prison, from a teenager to die in prison, and also where I'm secluded in solitary confinement, where I didn't have physical contact with other human beings at all. Like we could talk through the doors to one another, but I really didn't have too many conversations because I was a kid and really didn't relate to anybody that was in there. And so it came to the point to where it got so taxing on my mind that I actually attempted suicide while I was in there. I swallowed, I think, close to 60 pills, because I got to the point to where I just didn't want to deal with it anymore, with the combination of things that were going on with me, and I would rather take my own life. It didn't work, obviously, because I'm here talking today. They ended up pumping my stomach. And when I got back from the hospital, I had to come to the conclusion, okay, do I really want to try to take my life again, or I'm going to figure out some way to cope with my environment? So I found this office building that I could see into. And what I noticed is every morning there was an individual that came to work, and I was able to see him from the moment he got to work to the moment that he went to lunch and then came back. So I kind of began to mentally fixate my mind on being him. So how I coped is I would watch him while he sat there at his desk and work. I would act like I was sitting at my desk and work. And this was the only way that I can keep myself mentally busy going through this process to where I didn't started to regress. My mental health didn't started to regress. And I did this for about 18 months. And during that time, there was a lot of guys in there that I seen that wasn't able to cope with it and deal with it too well, and they mentally regressed. And then eventually I was taken out of that and transferred to prison at the age of 18. Now, my earliest experiences with prison and solitary confinement is I did a total of probably 5 years or a little more in solitary confinement, the longest being 19 months and the second longest being 13 months. And I did everything throughout that between that time as well. Prison solitary confinement was slightly different because a lot of the guys had already been in there for long periods of time versus the county jail. A lot of it is short term, other than myself, because I've actually had to live my stay there. And so what I noticed immediately was there was a lot of noise. Like you walk in and there's guys that's been down there potentially for years at a time, and it's very loud, and that bothered me for a long time. And so when I got down there, the first thing that was mentally taxing on me was like, why is it so freaking loud? Like, and over time, what I began to come to an understanding of is it's difficult for any human being to be in a cell by themselves, completely quiet for an extended period of time. And a lot of guys, in order just to hear sound, was making noise. And it got to the point for me personally where I actually started anticipating and welcoming the noise because the silence sometimes became too much. And so over time, when you're doing this time in the hole in solitary confinement, you begin to understand that noise is sometimes a part of sanity, but also noise sometimes is a part of insanity. And so each time I went to solitary confinement in prison, it was the exact same thing. Like my initial process, and a lot of guys that I did time with, initial processes were the exact same. Our first 1, 2, 3 days, we would sleep because there was a depression state, because you knew that you're going to be down here for months into years. And a lot of times that those years, especially back in the early days, we had nothing. We didn't have radios. We didn't have any type of communication, no telephones, just snail mail. And so you get depressed. You're there, you're like, okay, I'm depressed. And then after a few days, you get up, like you start to feel like, okay, how do I cope with this remaining time that I have to do? And a lot of times it's an individual like myself. I'm pacing back and forth inside of the small cell. The makeup of the cell was the exact same as the one in the county jail: a mat with a bed on it, a sink, toilet connected, and that's about it. And there you seeing nothing on the outside at all. So I didn't even have that. You don't get to see the outside world, the outside prison. It's just the walls you're in and then the unit. And so a lot of times I made chess pieces for myself personally, and I would make a chess board out of toilet paper. And when I made the board, I would just play chess by myself to keep myself sane, to keep myself focused on something. A lot of reading, a lot of writing, because you have to keep the mind busy while you're in this environment, or it's very easy for your mind to begin to slip away. And one example I can give of a person that I knew personally, like from society into prison, his very first time going to solitary confinement, he did about 13 months as well. And when he came into solitary confinement, he was his normal self, the normal individual that I've always knew. About 4 to 6 months into that solitary confinement stay, I started noticing certain changes with himself. He started to act out, and I believe, well, I know for a fact, because I've known him after that he started to have mental breaks, psychological breaks, to the point to where he started rubbing feces on himself and in the cell. throwing feces on officers and nurses that walked by, and even began to act out in a violent manner towards those he knew that were there, like myself and others who had always been his friends. He would act out violently, yell and scream. And at first I was like, man, what the heck is going on? And then, but once you start to understand what the actual environment of solitary confinement does to people, you start to feel sorry for them. It starts to be sad. And it became to the point to where I started to see and understand that this environment was breaking individuals, and all of these individuals, myself included, of course, because I'm now here, are also returning into society. So it seems as if that it was making people worse. And then a lot of the guys that go into solitary confinement, they repeat that cycle over and over again, because it becomes unbearable to deal with the liberties you have even in the prisoner population on what's called mainline, which is mainline is where everybody's at that's not getting in trouble. And so they end up going back into solitary confinement and keeping themselves in there, because with their mental health decrease, it's not a safe environment once you get back in the mainline, because you become a target. People start looking at these individuals as freaks. That's what they call them. Like, it's a freak because it's not a good understanding of mental health inside of prison and what these people are going through. So it's a sad thing. I don't believe any person goes through that experience and comes out the same. The first time I went into solitary confinement and came out, I don't believe I was the same. It does something to you. I became comfortable with myself, with being alone, which can be good and bad. But a lot of that comfortability came with talking to myself at times. I found myself pacing back and forth, having conversations with myself because there was nobody else to have conversations with. It's very, very daunting, like very, very daunting, especially when you're spending days upon days, months upon months, and years upon years, like locked in a cell by yourself. And in the prison solitary confinement, you don't even get out of the cell every day. So there's days you're 24 hours in locked down in your cell with nothing but yourself and a book and a pad and a paper. And really that's about it. And so I think the conversation we're currently having about solitary confinement is needed. I don't think it's completely understood a lot of times from the dynamic of society and how they look at it and how it's perceived. And I definitely think that it's something that needs to be abolished, and we need to rework what we consider punishment when an individual is incarcerated. Thank
you. Thanks, Anthony, for sharing your experiences. It's hard to imagine that we actually treat individuals this way. And when you describe your experiences, I think, it makes it very clear that how we're treating individuals and the way in which we are, quote unquote, punishing individuals feels very contrary to what it is that we believe these institutions should be about and what, as a society, we should be about. And to help us kind of explore the rationale behind solitary, I'm hoping, Dr. Kupers, based on what you heard, you could help us understand the social science behind solitary. What is the motivation behind it? Does it actually have a purpose? And what is the science telling us about the consequences of us using this type of mechanisms to, I think the intent is to control people's behaviors, but it really just feels like a dominance and control mechanism more than behavioral control. But yeah, if you could just talk to us about the science behind it, that would be great.
I would be happy to. Anthony, your story is just horrifying. There were no brass knuckles, there was no waterboarding, no hoods, but it's torture. Juan Mendez was the special rapporteur on torture of the United Nations. And he said that more than 15 days in solitary confinement is a human rights abuse and torture. And that's certainly what you very poignantly described. It's to your great credit that you survived and kept your mind. I just want to point out in your particular story, one of the more horrifying things is that you were in solitary from 16 to 18 years of age. that is the stage of life where we're learning to be people in society. And you were sitting in a cell by yourself, deprived of education, deprived of social connection. It is the most destructive thing. It's antithetical to rehabilitation. And we need to think about what we're putting people behind bars for. I mean, supposedly we're trying to rehabilitate people. Let me list a few symptoms, and I think Anthony would aver a whole lot of these. If you talk to people who are in solitary confinement for any length of time, almost all of them will say they have huge problems sleeping. They have massive anxiety, often panic attacks. They have trouble with memory and concentration. Anthony was able to read, and it was a very creative way to maintain his sanity. But a lot of people tell me they can't read because they forget what they read a page before. People have thinking disorders, often paranoia. If you think about paranoia, we're all a little bit paranoid. I walk into a room and there's some people talking in the far corner of the room, and I think, oh, they're talking about me and they're saying something bad. And I walk up to them and they say, "Hi, Terry." And I say to myself, oh, I was being paranoid. Or someone doesn't return a phone call and I think they're mad at me. And I run into them, they say they were sick or their phone wasn't working. And I think to myself, I was being paranoid. If you're in a cell by yourself, there's no way to do that kind of reality testing. So if you hear some officers down the tier laughing and making crude jokes, and you think they're going to come in here and beat me up or kill me, there's nothing you can do with that thought. There's no way to check out whether it's real or not. So it just grows in your consciousness. And I think that's where the paranoia comes from. Despair is huge. First of all, that window was covered in Anthony's cell. You don't know whether it's night or day, and often there's lights on in the middle of the night. So you really lose your sense of time. There's no clock, there's no calendar. And what happens is you develop the sense, I'm never going to get out of here. They're going to kill me. I'm going to die here. And there's a despair that comes of that. And then suicide. Suicide is a huge problem in prison. The general rate of suicide in prison is at least twice as much as in the community at large. But, and this is a stunning statistic, about 50%, actually in Oregon, it's been reported as 60% of successful suicides where the person dies occur among the 3 or 5 or 7% of the prison population who are in solitary confinement. So that's a statistical proof of causality. Solitary causes suicide. Not in everybody, but the rate is just extraordinary. And there are a number of symptoms like that: compulsive acts, pacing, cleaning the cell. Those all occur almost immediately. And that's in relatively stable people. People who have any kind of mental illness, the mental illness will be exacerbated. So some of the most severe cases of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, the most severe cases that I've ever seen, I've seen in solitary confinement units behind bars. Then over time, there's another set of symptoms, and it keeps getting worse. But what happens is people become numb to their feelings. They tell me, I just don't know what I'm feeling. They describe themselves as zombies or walking dead. And the other thing is that in spite of the fact they've been forced to be isolated, they actually try to isolate themselves more. So Anthony said you can talk across the door. You have to scream. But if you talk to your neighbor, people tell me that I've stopped talking to my neighbor. There's no reason to, there's nothing new to say. And what happens, and people just turn into themselves, which is very bad for mental health. Think about depression. Turning into oneself is the core symptom of depression, isolation. I've coined the term SHU post-release syndrome for a number of people that I've met who are released from the SHU, from the solitary confinement unit, but they're either still in prison or their prison term is over and they go home. And almost 100% of them stay in their room or stay close to their room or don't go out of their apartment or if they're in prison, they have the choice to come out of their cell or stay in the cell. They'll choose to stay in their cell. They have a lot of anxiety. They're reclusive. They want to be by themselves. Anthony is a stunning example of the opposite. He is just, Anthony, you have just made yourself healthy in spite of all these terrible forces. But they tend to isolate themselves and become reclusive, which of course is terrible for post-release success. So they just don't do well. I have coined the term decimation of life skills across the board. People with mental illness, the mental illness becomes worse, more disabling, more chronic. There's higher recidivism. People who were relatively stable at the start have a huge number of symptoms and a great deal of trouble adjusting when they get out in the community. I think I will stop there and we can talk more about various parts of this.
Thank you, Dr. Kupers. I think that was like a really nice introduction to the science. And I do have a number of follow-up questions that I will ask in just a moment. Ben, based off what you heard, both Anthony's experiences and the harms that are created by solitary, the science that demonstrates that, can you give us an understanding of, one, the legal framework that allows this to happen, and then two, how does solitary look in Oregon? Like what are the policies? What are the practices? What is your research? What have you discovered through your own sort of research on this issue? And when we talk about solitary, we've used the term solitary, SHU. What do we mean by solitary, legally speaking, or like in DOC practices? I mean, are we talking about a specific thing associated with solitary, or more broadly, are we talking about the kinds of conditions we find in solitary, or as we sort of commonly understand solitary, do we find those conditions in other settings in prisons as well? Oh, you're still on mute, Ben.
Yeah, all right, thanks, Bobbin. And thanks to everybody who's listening for paying attention and being concerned about this really difficult subject. So the Oregon Department of Corrections, like a lot of other prison systems in the United States, started relying on solitary more as just a simplistic stopgap back in the 1990s than as a real like intentional solution to the problems they were facing. The prisons were overcrowded and understaffed, and it was just a way to kind of do something that seemed like it could work in a crisis that became kind of institutionalized and like the go-to solution that officers and administrators had experience with, and they developed a certain inertia around continuing to use it, even as it has become more and more discredited as ineffective and destructive. But it doesn't even achieve the basic goals of maintaining safety and order in the prisons. And I will talk about sort of the legal structure of how we've gotten here, but I want to start by just saying that it has never actually been authorized by the Oregon legislature. It's just a practice that we've kind of backed ourselves into. The Oregon laws give the Department of Corrections authority to maintain order and discipline, but only with appropriate punishment and never with punishment that injures prisoners. And of course, not with cruel and unusual punishment either. So the Department of Corrections and the governor could end it now, but they persist. And I want to explain sort of the framework for how that works. So there is solitary confinement by many different names, many different pseudonyms that sort of make it sound less horrible than it really is. Things like administrative segregation or intensive management or disciplinary segregation. And each of those has its own sort of internal rule system that sets it up. But the thing they all have in common is that the person is alone in a very small, very bare cell with very little access to anything for about 23 hours per day, more in many situations. But theoretically, people are supposed to be able to come out of their cell for some exercise and showering and things like that 5 days per week. And the rest of the time, they're just locked in. I'll talk a little bit more about disciplinary segregation, because that's one of the most, like, what I've been focusing on a legal challenge to, and it's one of the most misguided and horrific forms of solitary confinement. In Oregon, it can be for up to 180 days, and as Dr. Kupers said, that violates international standards, as well as a lot of national standards and rules and the practices of other states, which I'll explain a little bit more. But basically, there are presumptive sentences for a lot of rule violations of 14 to 120 days, plus there can be consecutive sentences. And there can be just higher penalties even for the above those 14 to 120 days through what are called upward deviations. And most of the people in solitary confinement for disciplinary violations are there for nonviolent offenses, just simple rule violations of things as sort of vague and broad as disrespect of an officer, things like circulating a petition in prison without permission, possessing a cell phone. The Vera Institute for Justice did a analysis of the use of solitary confinement by the Department of Corrections in 2016 that gives us our best look at how it's enforced. And they found that by far the highest rate of solitary confinement was for the rule violation of disobedience of an order, nothing more. And that 6 of the top 10 offenses were nonviolent. They also found that there was a very serious racial disparity in the use of solitary confinement with, for example, the number of days that people were sanctioned varied by race, with the white population having the shortest sentences, and the African Americans being higher, and then the rate of the length of average stay in solitary confinement for Hispanic people was the highest and was almost double the length for the white prisoners. There's also far more people with mental health disabilities are in solitary confinement, and that is one of the worst manifestations of solitary confinement, because often these people have the least coping mechanisms and protective mechanisms against further harm from being in solitary confinement. And often people with mental health problems are caught in a downward spiral where they can't get out of solitary confinement, because, as Anthony described, they become more and more just deranged and start committing things that are deemed to be new offenses, and they are resentenced to solitary. And even though I said that the disciplinary solitary is capped at 180 days, people can often be moved to other forms of solitary confinement that can go on for years and years. And this vicious downward spiral of mental illness just trapping people in solitary confinement can just be never ending. And I guess I want to focus on my limited time just to talk a little bit more about some of the legality, or in our position, illegality of solitary confinement. It violates a lot of the sort of the ideals and specific parts of the Oregon Constitution. There's the very clear mandate against the use of unnecessary rigor in the punishment of prisoners. And this is a constitutional provision unique to Oregon and just 4 other states that says that punishment that is not necessary and is simply just for vindictive or that harms people is unacceptable. And solitary confinement is really, it flies in the face of that. It's absolutely unnecessary. There are far, far better alternatives that are being used in many other state Department of Corrections and county jails here in Oregon and by the Oregon Youth Authority. It's ineffective. It's toxic to the entire prison population. People who come out of solitary are more dangerous and harder to control. It also violates the ban on cruel and unusual punishment in the Oregon and US constitutions. Unfortunately, the US Supreme Court has been really pathetic in applying this to say that solitary confinement is unacceptable. However, they do recognize, and Oregon also recognizes, that this ban changes with the evolving standards of decency in our society. And I believe that Oregon's standards of decency have evolved above the national standard, and that the cruel and unusual punishment ban here is not as incapable of stopping the use of solitary confinement. But then there are also a different kind of principles in our Oregon Constitution, which say that punishment cannot be vindictive and harmful, and that it has to serve particular aspirational goals like public safety and responsibility, accountability, and reform of the prisoner. That's in our Constitution, and a requirement that prisoners have to be involved in work or other constructive activity, and that they have to learn to contribute, be responsible, and have skills that they can be proud of. And solitary confinement is anathema to these higher goals in our Constitution. It's just forced idleness. When people go to solitary confinement, they're ripped out of their jobs. They're taken out of education programs where they can learn things like anger management, conflict resolution, impulse control, alternatives to use of self-medication with drugs, even just classes on parenting and things like that. They lose all of the sort of sense of identity and ability to earn their keep and have valuable skills. Many people in prison work as firefighters, well, in various constructive jobs like training companion animals to be helpful to disabled people. And they get taken away from all of that to just sit helplessly on the floor or pacing, like Anthony described, in their cell, just waiting for the next meal ration instead of earning their keep and becoming a valuable member of society. And solitary confinement is just, there's no like scientific support behind it. Dr. Kupers talked excellently about how the science shows that it's harmful, but it's also just, there's no basis for it. It's just like this archaic practice that our prison so-called experts and administrators try to tell us we should accept, and the courts should accept, because they know what's best, and they're the ones who are there in the trenches and see what happens, and they deal with these violent people. But really, it's just this sort of conjured up rationale for something that true science shows more and more is just like backwards and counterproductive and expensive and destructive, and makes us all much less safe, and just have to deal with these problems that we're creating in solitary confinement. Okay, thanks. I'll turn it back over to the panel.
Thanks, Ben, Anthony, and Dr. Kupers for that introduction to solitary and providing that overview. I'm wondering, Anthony, if after hearing what Dr. Cooper said and what Ben said, if you could talk a little bit more about what you saw while you were in prison, as far as the solitary by another name, some of the ways in which people were sanctioned into solitary and what that looked like. Ben mentioned a lot of these violations were for nonviolent or issues that didn't create harms to other people or to themselves. But yeah, if you could just speak a little bit to that, that would be helpful so people could understand in a real way what it looks like in Oregon.
Absolutely. What's kind of funny is the longest stints I did in solitary confinement, 19 months and 13 months, were for nonviolent offenses. Both times it was for possession of a cell phone. And so I got the longest amount of time for things that weren't violence. Even like the times I got into fights, give me 40 days, 30 days, 60 days. So I kind of laughed to myself when being pointed that out, because I was like, yeah, that's a fact. Solitary by other names. We mentioned disciplinary segregation, which is they sanction you up to 180 days. They say you can't do more. What ends up happening after that, if they want to have you do more solitary confinement time, they switch you over to another institution, which is at Snake River, to what they call IMU, Intensive Management Unit. And their proclamation is that it's a program, it's not solitary confinement, it's not a punishment because you're programming it in there. So what they end up doing is putting you in another cell, isolated for the exact same amount of time each day, and give you these packets. And, to be quite honest, they're fairly generic packets, and they would be like very generic anger management packages or very generic Alcohol Anonymous packets. And you have to do these packets before you can get out of IMU, the Intensive Management Unit. And then even after you do the package, they can say, well, we want to give you some more packets because we don't think that was sufficient enough. And so they just classify it as something different, but it's the exact same. They have the behavioral health units, which are the mental health units, which those are the people that are living and suffering from severe mental illnesses, and they're isolated the exact same as well. They call that a program. They say they give them mental health treatment, but they're still living in isolation, which is still, wearing on their current mental conditions that they're living with. And so, like, it's a slick attempt to try to name something and make something synonymous, but it's the exact same results. And the exact same lived experience while you're in there. Also, you don't see a lot of individuals doing long stretches of times when it comes to violent offenses. A lot of those times, for whatever reason it is, they'll justify that and you get less time. Like I mentioned with myself, particularly, I've seen that a lot. It's very that the time that they give you is very vindictive. Like, for instance, if you get in a situation where there's an investigation involved and you refuse to talk about whatever it was, like, I don't want to give a statement. And this is what happened with me on both times that I got the 19 months and the 13 months. I didn't want to give a statement. They say they found the cell phone and I did refuse to talk about it. Their response was, okay, well, you'll rot down here until we figure out what's going on. So it's absolutely vindictive when they're doing what they're doing. And yeah, and what was the other question, Bobbin?
I think you got it all. It was just like trying to think about like why people are sanctioned, what it looks like, and then like this solitary by another name, which you've talked about, just anecdotally, but it was really just what does solitary look like? When people think about solitary, I think they most often think about this tool that's available to the Department of Corrections to use in these extreme kind of situations. And so, like, when we talk about the conditions of being like in your cell or in a small room for prolonged periods of time, how many different ways can that happen or in prison? How many different ways does that look in Oregon prisons?
Yes. You have what's been spoken about so far on the panel, disciplinary segregation. You have administrative segregation, which what they say is, oh, you're being put under investigation. It's not a punishment, but we need to remove you from the population for safety and security concerns. But you're not being punished, but you're being put in the exact same cell with the exact same restrictions as an individual that's down there for something that they've actually been sanctioned for at a hearing and received a disciplinary sentence for. So yeah, you have those two. You have the behavioral health. So it's about 4 altogether that they try to reclassify. And like, under every instance, it's a 6x9 cell, 23 to 24 hours lockdown, and very, very limited property. Like they say when you're on administrative segregation, like if you read it in its policy, it'll say, you receive your property and different things like that, but you don't. Like I've been under it several times myself, never received my property. What they say is, yeah, it says that in policy, but because we have to house you with everybody else that's under disciplinary segregation, it wouldn't be fair for you to be down there and have your property and they don't. So, yeah.
So Dr. Kupers, hearing both what Ben was talking about as far as like the legal standards, and then hearing Anthony's, experiences and what he's seen, and then your own introduction of the science behind it. What science supports solitary as a valid punishment, if any at all? And what science support? I mean, you've outlined sort of the harms of it, but what is peer-reviewed science telling us? And are the Department of Corrections actually using best practices, good science, good social science? I mean, how is it possible that we have this thing that's happening? Is it rooted in anything?
Well, the reference to science is absolutely bizarre and disingenuous. The science is this: solitary confinement has done nothing to reduce violence or gang membership in prison. It's still the same since the recent generation of solitary confinement, the supermax prison since the late 80s. The violence rate and gang participation has not been altered one bit. However, there's been massive human damage. So there are thousands of studies, I've performed a lot of them, evidencing great emotional harm. As I said, it exacerbates every form of serious mental illness. The suicide rate is sky high, and the experience of people after they get out of solitary. Anthony is not representative. Anthony, you are extraordinary, how articulate and how together you are. You were figuring out how to survive, as you said, so your mind wouldn't slip away. Most guys don't do that. So when I'm challenged because my evidence is anecdotal. If I were to interview Anthony and get him to tell me what he just told all of us, all right, that would be an anecdotal report. If I go see 3 more people and they tell me the identical things, we're getting further away from anecdotal now. I have interviewed over 500 people in solitary or previously in solitary for a significant time. They've all said the exact same thing. That is not anecdotal evidence. That is qualitative research, and it's very valid in the scientific community. So solitary has absolutely no positive effect any which way. It does not reduce violence, it doesn't help with the gang problem. However, it causes immense psychiatric damage. So the question is, why do they do it? And I have my own opinion about that. I think it's a PR job. That is, everybody knows solitary doesn't help. Everybody, you speak to a correction officer and you say, tell me something. When guys get out of solitary, are they easier to manage? No, they're in trouble. They're either mentally ill or they're angry and get into fights or whatever. So why do they do it? They do it to support the notion that the officers walk the toughest beat. In other words, we've got these heinous criminals in solitary confinement. Anybody who has gone into a supermax prison or solitary confinement unit knows that is just a lie. The people you meet are fairly ordinary. Some of them are very bright. Some of them aren't so bright. Some of them are very mean. Some of them are extremely kind, empathic, and caring towards others. Just like the population out in the community, there's every kind of person in solitary. They're not particularly violent. They're not particularly tough. They just, for one reason or another, usually a minor infraction, got put in solitary confinement. Then their condition deteriorated and they talked back to an officer which got them more time in solitary, another disciplinary infraction. So that what happens is you develop a population of people who spend most of their time in prison in solitary confinement. They are broken and they do not do well later on. So it is not the science, that's the science. I've just told you the science. And we know that solitary confinement of all forms, whether it's submarines, prisoners of war, the things that preceded the correctional use of solitary have caused immense human damage. That's the science. There's no question that it's scientific. And I think that what's happening is solitary confinement is being used to convince legislatures to fund the prisons, have the prisons budget increase so they can build more solitary because they're dealing with the worst of the worst. It's a total fraud. And the people are not the worst of the worst. They're really ordinary. And like Anthony, there's a lot of really sympathetic people who I just would be happy to have at my house. And it's just a fraudulent portrayal of heinous criminals in solitary, which then keeps the law and order politics going and keeps the funding going to the prisons and the jails.
Thank you, Dr. Kupers. It's a lot to take in because, as we've dug into the issue of solitary and a lot of the policies that sustain our criminal legal system, the more and more we discover how disconnected they are actually from any type of science or social science or behavior, understanding of behavioral health. And then it begs the question, like, why is this all here? And, the only answers that become like really apparent are its roots in racism and white supremacy, this, law and order type of rhetoric, this, politics of fear and anger. But if that's the case, then if we understand this to be, for lack of a better terms, like this is something that I know you and I have discussed, this feels a lot like junk science, like this whole discipline of forensic science that was created by law enforcement out of nothing in order to prosecute people and to confirm guilt, that was debunked by the National Academy of Science in 2009, this whole area of, forensics. What parallels do you see to that and corrections kind of making up this out of nothing? I mean, as you mentioned, the legislature hasn't mandated this. We looked at the statutory origins of power for the Department of Corrections in creating this. But I mean, what parallels do you see to forensics and junk science and how this is being used?
Well, I mentioned the fraudulent nature of the whole thing. The people that go to solitary confinement are very ordinary. I'll tell you the prototypic person, and Anthony, tell me if this is either you or this person. They enter the correctional system in their teens, usually for minor crimes, but it might be for having a gun or doing a robbery or drugs or something. But it's a teenager acting out, doing something stupid. That teenager has a lot of trauma in their background. They've been beaten, sexually abused. They're, watching people being killed. They have massive trauma. They go into prison instead of going to school and having an ordinary social life. As Anthony says, spending 16 to 18-year-olds in solitary confinement, that's almost guaranteed to wreck someone. And then they get shuffled around in the criminal legal system. They're not heinous criminals. They're not the worst of the worst. Rather, they're ordinary, very traumatized people who get totally destroyed by the criminal legal system. And then while that's going on, there has to be a justification. So a false science grows up. There have been a few studies that show, the complaint about my research, Craig Haney's research over the years has been, there's really no evidence that solitary confinement causes harm. Well, as I just said, 100% of the over 500 people I've interviewed tell me about massive harm. They don't know each other. They didn't make it up. And there is huge amount of evidence. But then the people that say there's no evidence, they do false science to prove that it doesn't do harm. And there have been a few high-profile studies like that. And we've debunked them. They're very fraudulent science. And the methodology is very flawed. And almost unanimous scientific finding is that solitary does great harm. So then I think we have to ask appropriately, why do they keep doing it when they know it causes harm?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the question. Like, why do we keep doing it? And I wonder, Ben, I'm hoping to get you to chime in on this parallel between the junk science that we've debunked now and the parallels you see with corrections and using solitary.
Yeah, thanks. So an example of the junk science that we can compare it to is the old sort of forensic science of blood spatter evidence, where it basically just came from police who had this idea that they thought that they could figure out like how someone had been injured or shot or something like that based on like blood spatter on the wall or on the body. And it sounded kind of plausible to them. And, they just, judges and juries and public and TV programs about, true crime and stuff, they all kind of like were like, well, these sort of self-styled experts tell us that this is the way it works. And we just, they're telling us we ought to believe them because they're in those crime scenes figuring these things out. There's a lot of other forensic evidence like that, like hair and fiber analysis, even fingerprinting got way more deference than it should have. It turns out that a lot of it was very subjective and that different fingerprint analysts wouldn't come up with the same results. And we really have the same thing here. And part of how we can see that is the resistance within departments of corrections to change, even in the face of contradictory evidence. Some reformers within the Oregon Department of Corrections resorted to sending people, corrections officers, to Norway to see how alternatives are working so much better there, because it was the only way they could try to change the mindset. And people came back, some of these officers from Norway, just saying things like, at first I felt like I just had to quit my job because I realized I had been doing this wrong for so long and doing so much damage. Or people said, I saw that the corrections officers over there in Norway just were so much happier and felt so much more fulfilled by their jobs. And I guess I want to emphasize that it's very harmful to corrections officers as well. States that have reduced their reliance on solitary confinement have very striking reduction in workers' compensation claims and sick leave by prison staff, a huge drop in the suicide rate of prisoners and staff, and also a decrease in stress-related like physical disorders. There's a reduction in diabetes, obesity, heart disease. There's just a terrible burden of stress that comes from caging people like this, and the violence and dealing with the mental breakdown of these people that hurts staff and hurts the whole prison and eventually pollutes the society. And one of the worst things that happens is when there's no plan to prevent people from being discharged straight out onto the street from solitary confinement. Oregon has no rules or procedures to prevent that. People can be, in long-term solitary and then suddenly released and have no skills for coping with being around people or being in like the types of interactions necessary to maintain a job or be present with their family members. And often they have been deprived of visitation for a long, long time. And another way we see that it's junk science is that other states have moved on, especially in the Northwest. Oregon has become really an outlier and far behind the practices of other states. And that's in the context of the United States being far behind and an outlier in international standards as well. So we're really in an extraordinary situation where Washington State has abolished disciplinary solitary confinement entirely and is trying to reduce reliance on some of these other euphemistic terms that Anthony described so well, solitary by other names. Idaho has limited disciplinary solitary to 15 days. California has limited it to 10. And other major states, New York has passed laws that are taking effect in early 2022 that put a lot of limits on solitary confinement. Certainly the 15-day cap, but they've also said that people can't be confined in their cell for more than 15 hours per day in any of these other sort of intensive management programs or anything like that. So solitary has been, I mean, the science has been discredited by the practices of other nearby states. And we see that it's not necessary. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
So we are coming up to about an hour, and I have just a couple more questions that I'd like to kind of conclude us on. There's one question that someone asked on social media, and maybe Dr. Kupers, you have an answer to this, but I kind of want to expand on it too. The question is, are officers administered regular psych evaluations so punitive power trip guards are not perpetrating or perpetuating, harmful loop for these prisoners? And I think that's a really good point or question to bring up is what kind of background do COs do you see have in being able to monitor or administer these punishment? And then on the flip side, Anthony, maybe you can talk about this. What is the access to mental health counselors for people that are in solitary in Oregon? I mean, I have some anecdotal stories myself from people that we've worked with, but I'd like to hear from you. So Dr. Kupers, if you could just for just a minute or two talk about the background and training for COs, and then Anthony for a couple minutes just talk about like the access that you saw to mental health counselors for people who are in segregation or solitary.
Well, let me start by saying that what goes on in prison for the most part is secret. The public does not know about it, nor do they care. The whole point of putting people in prison is get rid of them, disappear the problem. So it's set up for abuse. I have been accused of being anti-police, anti-officer. I absolutely am not. I think a lot of people go into law enforcement for very good reasons. They want to help people. They want to maintain safety. However, there are bad apples among them. The bad apples tend to congregate in solitary confinement units. First of all, the work is easy. You don't have to relate to anybody. You know, on the yard, you talk to people and you say, how's it going? How's your mother? And, you know, in solitary, no one talks to people in a solitary cell. They pass them a food tray. So the bad officers rise to the top and they start abusing the prisoners. Now, the problem with all the officers is that they don't report the abuse. It's called excessive use of force. And what happens is there's a blue code where they don't snitch on each other. Just like the prison code, the prisoners don't snitch on each other, but that's okay. That's just people who are in captivity. When the people who are supposed to be representing the state and keeping people inside prison safe actually either abuse, they beat up, or they don't report when they see another officer beat up a prisoner unfairly. I want to get back to something Ben said about the race issue here. You know, it is extremely shameful that in this country, we have between 40 and 50% of people behind bars are African Americans. They only make up 13% of the population. What is that about? And here's where the false science develops. When you give most scientists the assignment, why is that? What they do is they go study Black individuals and they try to find out some kind of psychological tendency that leads so many of them to be in prison. That's the wrong place to look. What we ought to be looking is the police presence in the inner city community, how much more likely a African-American individual is to be arrested rather than just sent home with a warning, how much more likely they are to be convicted and given a long sentence. A huge majority of people who are either given 3 strikes or sent to the death chamber are African Americans. What's that about? It's not about a personality trait that is more frequent in African Americans. It's about racism, pure and simple. But a science that begins the study by going to look at what's inside the head of a Black individual is going to be false science even before it gets started.
Yeah, Anthony, I mean, just on that, like our organization has spoken a lot about white supremacies and the roots of our current mass incarceration system, and how it's all derived from that ideology. It perpetuates those systems of bigotry and racism and prejudice. So I think it's a very important point, and one that we haven't discussed enough, I think, in the use of solitary and its disproportionate impact. But it is something that I think other national organizations have studied quite a bit, and I think could be easily found on the internet if people do a search on the internet. But it is, you cannot talk about the criminal legal system without talking about white supremacy and racism and the disproportionate impact it has on Black men, communities of color, the Native community also. And so, but yeah, Anthony, to the question about like access to mental health and your own experiences with racism and inside the institutions too, if that's something you'd like to share.
Yes, well, access to mental health, it's a few elements to it. There is access to mental health, but the access is very limited because there's not enough manpower in order to deal with the amount of people who are suffering from mental health crises in disciplinary segregation or solitary confinement. So you have that element to where there's just not enough BHS nurses to deal with it. And then you have also the element of the stigma. So a lot of guys will be suffering from these mental health crises, but because of the stigma associated with the lack of education about it amongst the prison population, they refuse to say anything about it or ask for help. So that's one element. And then the other element is a lot of guys will go through these psychological breakdowns in solitary confinement, and that outworking shows up in many different ways. But what happens is they end up punished by the officers instead of the officers getting the mental health professionals to come deal with the situations. So a guy may be in his cell screaming because he's going through a psychotic breakdown because he's been in solitary confinement for 6 to 8 months or longer. And the officer come either one, macing, which macing through in the cell because he won't calm down. Two, they do have what they call suit up, to where the officers actually put on riot gear and then run into the cell to snatch the person out of the cell to tie them up to make them calm down, or just plain beat them up. And that's a sad reality of what really goes on when these guys are experiencing these psychoses a lot of times, and that's what it is. As far as racism within my experience in institutions, is very much prevalent. I think Dr. Cooper said it very, very, very well. The reality is a lot of these policies and practices are steeped in white supremacy and racism. And the reason we see these disproportionate numbers in solitary confinement as well as the prison populations is because it's working exactly as they wanted to design. I mean, exactly how they designed it. I mean, straight to the point.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's so much more that we could talk about, and we only had an hour, but I just want to thank everyone, Dr. Kupers, Anthony, and Ben, for sharing their insights and perspective on this issue. It's an important issue. I think one that there is, unfortunately and intentionally, a lack of information about how it's used, transparency around the rates in which it's used, how people are being impacted and harmed. And I think this big thing that is just, it's based on a junk science or a false science, as Dr. Cooper says. Like, there's nothing that's holding this up as being actually something that's useful or is useful for society. So, there's, I think, a number of resources out there that you can find. Our organization will be spending more time on this issue. It is a priority issue for us. Beginning this week, early next week, and as we enter into 2022. We're hopeful that through the different branches of government, whether it's engaging with the governor's office and the executive branch as far as changes that we can make to current practices through rules in the Department of Corrections, through the courts, and looking at ways to be able to advance the abolition of solitary confinement through the courts, and also through the legislature, that we will be looking at this as a policy priority in the upcoming legislative sessions and how to engage with the legislature. So we'll be looking for every avenue that we can in order to reform and abolish the use of solitary confinement here in Oregon as we move forward. Just be on the lookout for that information starting in the next week or so. But if you have any questions, feel free to post them on Facebook and we'll try to get back to you and post it there. But again, I just want to thank Dr. Kupers, Anthony, and Ben, and also Alice and Beatrix, our communications team, who helped put this together. And stay tuned for the rest of the week. We have great panels that will be there. And if you're watching this on a recorded time, look at our Facebook page for additional videos on different issues that we'll be discussing or have talked about. Thank you.